Question of weaponized cancer was in my mind from the church committee hearings that you can see still on YouTube. I believe they haven't all been taken down. So from there, I found in a bookstore one day my copy of Dr. Mary's Monkey. I purchased it in October of 2015. And since then, I've had the opportunity to read through it at least twice and mostly 3 times through. So the best thing I think I can do to help introduce the book is to read some of the prefatory material. Dr. Mary's Monkey, the subtitle is How the Unsolved Murder of a Doctor, a Secret Laboratory in New Orleans, and Cancer-Causing Monkey Viruses are linked to Lee Harvey Oswald, the JFK assassination, and emerging global epidemics. Chris Milligan, the publisher who has been a guest on my show, wrote a foreword to the book, which I'll read. This revised and updated edition of Dr. Mary's Monkey is a culmination of over 2 decades of work, and I am proud to be its publisher. While this book is about the past and how it affects the present, it is also about the future, so that the generations yet to come will have the ability to read about the origins of the plagues that afflict us and them. We hope that this work facilitates lasting change, garners us some understanding of our history, and helps us to make sure a situation such as this doesn't happen again. The public health problems addressed in Dr. Mary's Monkey have not gone away. In fact, they've gotten worse and are sure to be with us for years to come. The cancer epidemic, which Ed Haslam first talked about in 1995, has grown substantially and has killed over 15 million people in the United States since he first coined the term. And let me see, when is this publication? This publication was reprint to 2014. Okay. So as of then, 15 million people killed by cancer since he first coined the term. So from 1995, that's 20 years. When Ed Haslam self-published this story as Mary, Fairy, and the Monkey Virus in 1995, he shook the JFK research community with an alarming new perspective on the JFK assassination, one centered on the unsolved murder of Dr. Mary Sherman in New Orleans and the specter of an undisclosed biological weapon. As the acclaimed JFK assassination author Jim Marrs said, quote, Haslam opened a whole new can of worms. Reading that book was the first time I ever encountered the term cancer epidemic, and I had never pondered how a bioweapon might have fit into the matrix around JFK's murder or its cover-up. What he had to say was definitely new. So when Haslam contacted me about publishing his book, I jumped at the opportunity. And now I'm going to skip forward to the Jim Marrs' own foreword to this book. There is nothing new to learn about the assassination of JFK. Words like these have become almost a mantra among sanctimonious media pundits and complacent publishers. The problem is that they're not true. In this book, Ed Haslam takes our knowledge of the dark underpinnings of the 1960s to a new level by offering a whole new look at events surrounding the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. He focuses on activities in New Orleans during 1963, reaching far beyond Lee Harvey Oswald's leafleting or his contracts with anti-Castro Cubans, government agents, and mobsters. Anyone who has seen the Oliver Stone film JFK or has read one of the many books on the assassination knows of New Orleans District Attorney Jim Garrison's ill-fated prosecution of International Trademark Director Clay Shaw. We know of Guy Bannister, the ex-FBI agent who was connected to the CIA, anti-Castro Cubans, and the accused assassin Oswald. We know of David Ferry, a defrocked priest who was connected to the mafia, the CIA, and Oswald. Shaw was able to successfully argue that he'd never met Ferry or Oswald. Today, we know that that claim is simply untrue. It is now well accepted that officials within the federal government of the United States of America took steps to effectively block and derail Garrison's probe. It seemed the New Orleans investigation was at an end. But what if all that activity in New Orleans had nothing to do with the assassination? What if there was some other reason for sabotaging Garrison's investigation? After all, there is not one hard piece of evidence linking the Shaw-Ferry axis to the events in Dealey Plaza. Ferry, the man connected to Oswald, the mob, and the CIA, never got closer to Dallas than a Houston phone booth. And there was never any serious accusation that Clay Shaw went to Dallas. Could there have been a deeper secret reason why the Garrison investigation had to be shut off? And could that reason have had more to do with the contaminated polio vaccines and the secrecy of a deadly biological weapon experiment than any plotting against President Kennedy? In his 1995 book, Mary, Ferry, and the Monkey Virus, Haslam opened a new can of worms when he revealed the medical experiments that had taken place in David Ferry's apartment in 1963. He was one of the first to bring to the public the now well-documented story of how the polio vaccines of the 1950s were adulterated with cancer-causing viruses derived from monkey glands. Federal certification officers were aware of the possibility of the polio vaccine being defective, but were pressured into approving the vaccine by powerful medical interests, including Dr. Alton Ochsner of New Orleans. Pardon me a second. I pressured into, expedited approval. Well, it resonates, does it not? Once the magnitude of the cancer-causing viruses in the polio vaccines became known, a massive covert effort was undertaken in an attempt to find a cure or preventative. All this was clandestine work, very hush-hush. No one wanted the American public to know that the polio vaccines inoculated into millions of our citizens were contaminated with dangerous monkey viruses, perhaps causing the cancer epidemic of recent years. But then the story took an even darker turn. The CIA began to take an interest in the work. After all, this was a time when documented efforts were underway to find a subtle way of assassinating Fidel Castro. Military and intelligence eyes sparkled at the prospect of somehow injecting Castro with cancer. His death would appear natural, and there would be no accusations from the Soviet Union. But what was Oswald's role in all this activity? The evidence of Oswald's intelligence work for the U.S. government is overwhelming. Did he become involved in a biological weapons experiment so monstrous that its secret had to be maintained at all costs? Diligent researchers know that Oswald was playing intelligence games in New Orleans in the summer of 1963. One day, he was handing out pro-Castro literature on street corners, some of it stamped with the same address as Bannister's anti-Castro office at 544 Camp Street. Another day, Oswald was offering his services to anti-Castro militant Carlos Bringuier, Bringuier. Oswald's duplicity resulted in what appeared to authorities as a staged fight between Oswald and Bringuier on a New Orleans street. Oswald was arrested for disturbing the peace. While in jail, he did not ask to see a lawyer, but instead someone from the FBI. Despite being outside normal business hours, FBI agent John Quigley arrived and spent more than an hour with Oswald, who commenced to detail his activities since arriving in New Orleans, almost as though he was making a report to superiors. Yet Oswald made no public mention of David Ferrie on his work at Ferrie's cancer lab. I'd just make a moment to, I imagine George Webb may be watching. There is that connection between the FBI and Lee Harvey Oswald right here on page 14 of the introduction. According to information gathered by Haslam, Oswald was much more closely connected to his uncle, Charles Muret, and New Orleans crime lord Carlos Marcello than previously suspected. But Haslam's primary focus is on the strange and horrible death of Dr. Mary Sherman, whose charred body was found in her home in July 1964. She had been stabbed multiple times. Her body exhibited the effects of extreme scorching and heat, yet there were only superficial fire damage to her bed and home. He also delves into Oswald's work with Ferrie in the covert cancer lab and its fatal results. His research provides a plausible explanation for the caged white mice reported in Ferrie's apartment, Oswald's missing time at the Riley Coffee Company, and for the never fully understood trip to Clinton, Louisiana by Oswald, Ferrie, and Shaw. Ed Haslam's research may indeed change the way we think about the assassination, about Lee Harvey Oswald, and about the greatest health scandal in history. That is, so far. The tragic assassination of President John F. Kennedy may come to be seen as a mere bump in the road of a series of national scandals and conspiracies which have plagued the United States right up to today. Jim Marrs, spring of 2007. Now, I'm going to skip through a lot of it because, as we know, I'm trying to do a 1-hour summary. So it's just, I would love to read the whole book to you tonight, but it would be impossible. So I'm going to concentrate on some of the chapters that I just find the most compelling for many reasons. The book starts off with Ed Haslam, a student at Jesuit High School in New Orleans, and his father, a medical doctor in orthopedic. And they learn about Dr. Sherman's death, and he becomes highly suspicious and tries to find out details, and really became almost an investigative journalist himself right then as a youth. Ed Haslam went on to study marketing and worked in New York at an advertising agency for his principal part of his career, and then took the time to write the first edition of the book. And this is, of course, the updated second edition. Now I'm going to start reading here at Tulane Medical School, where they were doing research on monkey viruses, and I'll start reading on page 17. Actually, there were some very good reasons to keep subjects like researching monkey viruses quiet. The main ones were potential public panic over an accidental epidemic, growing public pressure from the animal rights movement, and the secrecy demanded by covert operations. The possibility of public panic over an accidental epidemic was a real and present danger to both researchers and their financial backers. One bad incident might trigger a public outcry that would effectively shut down all research for years. The possibility of such an accidental epidemic was very real, and the scientists knew it. Is that not eerie to read? During the early 1960s, there were numerous outbreaks of infectious diseases among the animal handlers in monkey labs around the country. Waterborne diseases were transferred through saliva, moisture in the breath, and urine. They could be caught just by being around the primates. Cleaning out animal cages was dangerous. Feeding a monkey was dangerous. Taking a monkey out of a cage was dangerous. Holding a monkey was dangerous. Primates are intelligent mammals, and they quickly figured out that a trip with a handler often meant getting stuck with needles, or having the top of the skull chopped off with a power saw, or being injected with psychoactive drugs. The monkeys fought back. They bit their handlers. They urinated on them. They tried to escape. Monkey handlers who drew blood from one cancerous monkey to inject it into another occasionally stabbed themselves with needles full of blood laced with carcinogenic monkey viruses. The dangers were enormous, and the controls were feeble by today's standards. The generality of all this is well documented in medical libraries around the country. One book published during the 1960s made the point clearly in its title, quote, "The Hazards of Handling Simians," and listed the numerous outbreaks of diseases in the primate research facilities during the previous 2 decades. Then monkey handlers would go home and resume their normal lives, including sexual activities. The potential for zoonoses, that is, diseases that jump from animal to man, was very real, and the medical community knew it. Consider these comments written in the 1960s by Richard Fiennes, Britain's leading primate researcher, about the dangers of primate research, "There is a serious danger that viruses from such closely related groups as the simian primates could show an altered pathogenesis in man, of which malignancy could be a feature. The dangers of such happening are enhanced by man's exposure in crowded cities to oncogenic agents and increased radiation hazards. The danger of transmitting simian viruses in vaccines is a real and alarming one. The further danger is that simian viruses might become adapted to human populations and spread with appalling rapidity and under circumstances in which there were no possibility immediate means of control. Knowledge of prophylaxis against viral diseases is in its infancy, and time must elapse before any effective vaccine could be prepared, tested, and manufactured in bulk to protect populations against a pandemic caused by a new virus. Plainly, it is in the realms of virology that primate zoonoses present the greatest danger. Far too little is known of the virology of simians." Does this sound familiar? Does it not predict the current AIDS epidemic? Speaking further of this danger, Fiennes discussed Anyang-Nyang, a mildly lethal virus that swept Africa. Had Anyang-Nyang been attended by a high death rate, the human population of a large part of East and Central Africa would have virtually ceased to exist. To such an extent, in spite of 20th century medicine, is man still vulnerable to attack from new viruses. The danger was real. The fear of public panic was real. With experimental animals, unpredictable viruses, and exposed animal handlers intermingled in a sweltering tropical city of nearly 1 million people, like New Orleans, the opportunity for a biological disaster was ripe. It's hard to read this without just thinking of Wuhan and our current disaster. The idea of an epidemic suddenly sweeping the streets of an American city was not foreign to the public. In fact, a movie called Panic in the Streets won the Academy Award for Best Screenplay in 1952. But the press of the 1950s and 60s either did not consider the public's interest in medical matters substantial enough to warrant coverage, or they felt they had a higher duty to prevent public panic. For example, an accident occurred at a Yale laboratory in the 1990s. The headline in Time shouted, A deadly virus escapes. The subheadline continued. Concerns about lab security arise as a mystery disease from Brazil strikes a Yale researcher, unquote. The researcher worked at a biohazard 3 lab and was studying a rare, potentially lethal virus when he broke a test tube. He failed to report the incident, which sprayed this virus into his nostrils. Instead, he went to visit friends in Boston. When the incident was discovered, the researcher was quarantined and his friends were put under medical surveillance. The article concluded, if researchers do not tighten some of their procedures, the next outbreak might not be so benign. All of which makes one wonder, what safety procedures were enforced in the monkey labs of the 1960s, and what procedures would have been followed in an underground medical laboratory with no visible sponsor? To understand the type and extent of monkey virus research being done in medical schools in the 1950s and 60s, I went to medical libraries and started reading the history of virology. While even an overview of these activities is beyond our scope at the moment, there are a few points worth mentioning. First is that it was well established in these medical research circles around the world prior to 1960 that certain monkey viruses caused various types of cancer, including cancers of the skin, lungs, and bones. Secondly, experimentation with carcinogenic viruses was widespread throughout the network of primate research centers, from the US to Europe to the USSR. Blood, tumor cells, and viral extracts were routinely taken from a variety of animals and injected into monkeys like a game of viral roulette. One lab created tumors in as little as 8 days. Another lab injected human volunteers with the known cancer-causing monkey viruses to observe the effects. New diseases started to appear, diseases which were unknown in the wild. One such disease that first appeared in the lab is now called SAIDS, or simian AIDS. It occurred when African monkey viruses were given to Asian monkeys. SIV, the retrovirus that collapsed the immune systems of Asian monkeys, did not cause disease in its natural host, the African green monkey. In addition to viral roulette, researchers experimented with radiation therapy, beaming X-rays and gamma rays directly into tumors to encourage remission. The medical researchers of the 1960s irradiated tumors in laboratory animals, including primates, and shot radiation directly into the tumors of human patients. Think this one through before we proceed. When you shoot a radioactive beam at a tumor, you not only hit the tumor, but you also hit the blood and viruses in and around the tumor. Was the type of radiation used to dissolve cancer tumors strong enough and focused enough to damage the DNA and RNA of the viruses floating in the patient's blood? At this point, the medically sophisticated reader might say, wait a minute, the radiation exposure of a clinical X-ray machine does minimal damage to DNA or RNA, and very many people receive very many X-rays without getting cancer. And this is true where we are talking about the exposure and energy levels associated with common clinical use, which have been clinically established as relatively safe for humans. However, in the late 1950s, a powerful new device emerged from the physics lab and quietly began to be distributed to select medical research facilities. It was called a linear particle accelerator. Never before had a machine of this magnitude been put into a commercial workplace. You might think of a poor man's atom smasher. These high-voltage scientific machines were capable of doing things never done before, and they spawned new ultra-high-tech applications that stretched the imagination. Their basic capabilities included producing high-energy radiation and hurling subatomic particles near the speed of light into whatever object one desired. In Louisiana, the Delta Regional Primate Center opened its doors in November 1964 with Tulane University serving as host institution. This took the monkey virus research out of downtown New Orleans and put it into 500 wooded acres near Covington, Louisiana, across Lake Pontchartrain. Today, that laboratory has over 4,000 primates, 30 scientists, and 130 support workers, plus a public relations director whose job it is to boast of the center's virus research, especially on AIDS, and to point to the improvements in lab security, such as the high security zone, where researchers and staff shower and change clothes before approaching or leaving the 500 monkeys infected with simian AIDS. Despite these security measures, Delta was back in the headlines in 1994 when 83 monkeys escaped. The public was told to call Delta to report any monkeys seen swinging through the trees, the center having claimed the week before that nearly all of them had been captured. Well, I'm going to skip forward some now because I want to introduce some more of the characters in this amazing story. So we'll jump forward to the Jim Garrison investigation of the JFK administration, of JFK assassination. I'm going to start here on page 41. Well, let me back up a little bit because I think this is also important. Jim Garrison, in turn, appeared on national television and stated in an unambiguous language that a faction within the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency had murdered the President of the United States. Gesturing to the camera, he waved sworn statements from witnesses who claimed that their testimony to the Warren Commission had been altered to distort important information. If that was not enough, he went further, reminding the American people that the order to hide the hard evidence, Kennedy's x-rays and the autopsy photos, from the American people came directly from the Oval Office in the White House. Garrison said bluntly that there had been a coup d'etat right here in the United States, and that the press had ignored it. This was a difficult time for people whose families were connected to the Garrison investigation. Several of my close friends had family members involved, and I saw their dilemma firsthand. The basic situation was this: if Kennedy's murder had been planned in New Orleans, then something should be done about it. Many people supported Garrison's efforts. He was, after all, a legally elected law enforcement official investigating a murder within his jurisdiction. On the other hand, Garrison was investigating some sensitive issues and some very important people. On the national front, he had discovered the U.S. government's secret war against Cuba, uncovering in the process that elements of the CIA were involved with the mafia and were trying to kill Castro. For example, Clay Shaw, whom Garrison arrested and charged with conspiring to murder John Kennedy, was former general manager of the International Trade Mart, one of the city's most important business institutions. Garrison claimed that Shaw had personally been associated with Lee Harvey Oswald and had helped Kennedy's killers by setting up Oswald to take the fall for Kennedy's death. I'm going to skip forward a good bit now to talk about Dr. Alton Ochsner. Chapter 8, Dr. O. People tend to respect both medical reputations and financial success. Dr. Alton Ochsner had plenty of both. Before his life was over, he had been president of the American Cancer Society, president of the American College of Surgeons, president of the International Society of Surgeons, the chairman of the section on surgery for the American Medical Association, and president of the Alton Ochsner Medical Foundation, one of the largest medical centers in America, with annual revenues approaching $300 million per year. As a recognition of his contributions, he received the Distinguished Service Award of the American Medical Association in 1967. As all could see, he was a highly respected man of medicine, clearly above suspicion, as it is commonly known. But there was another side of Alton Ochsner, which the public did not see clearly. He used his position and contacts to advance his right-wing political philosophy, and in the process developed a long, complex relationship with powerful political figures and agents of the U.S. government. A.J. Ochsner's influence cast a long shadow. He was the founder and later president of the American College of Surgeons, as well as head of the University of Illinois Medical School. His international contacts were considerable. A.J., that's his father, saw to it that Alton trained under the leading surgeons of the day. A.J. Ochsner's best friend was William J. Mayo, founder of the famous Mayo Clinic in Minnesota. And when it was time for Alton Ochsner to start his own clinic, the Mayo Clinic was used as a model. Then in 1922, again thanks to his uncle's influence, Alton Ochsner headed to Europe for the 2-year residency in Switzerland and Germany. The first big medical success of his career was bringing blood transfusions to Europe, or should we say, back to Europe. Early attempts at blood transfusions had failed miserably. It was not until an Austrian physician named Karl Landsteiner developed techniques for blood typing that blood transfusions became safe. Landsteiner's original work had been ignored in Europe, so he came to the United States in 1912 and introduced the technique at A.J. Ochsner's hospital in Chicago. Alton Ochsner learned to type blood while working in his uncle's laboratory. In 1923, while still in Switzerland, he married the daughter of a wealthy American family whom he had met in Chicago. Soon they departed on a kind of a victory tour, visiting first European and then American medical clinics for several months. In Europe, he got his first exposure to politics and witnessed epidemic inflation firsthand. When he first arrived, the exchange rate was 4 marks to the dollar. When he left, it was 4 million marks to the dollar. And skipping forward to get to some of the important characters here. Patients at the Ochsner Clinic. Another patient was Juan Peron, the president and dictator of Argentina. Ochsner flew to Buenos Aires to treat Peron for a problem in one of his legs. Peron complimented Ochsner, saying that surgeons were, quote, men of action. Peron was on the mark. Ochsner prided himself in his action orientation, saying, once you know what needs to be done, there's no point in waiting. Following the lead of these dictators came the oligarchies of Latin American countries, which had not developed their own healthcare systems. By the late 1980s, over 10,000 patients per year were coming from Latin America to the Ochsner Clinic for treatment. There were so many that Ochsner built a hotel on the hospital grounds to house the Latin patients' relatives and hired a staff of Spanish-speaking interpreters to meet their needs. On the American side, Ochsner accumulated many celebrities in his patient portfolio, from golfing legend Ben Hogan to movie star Gary Cooper to the mega-wealthy Clint Murchison of the Texas oil family. Murchison's involvement with Ochsner seems to me to have been as political as medical. Yes, he was a personal patient of Alton Ochsner and gave him a Cadillac as a thank you present. but he also donated $750,000 to the Alton Ochsner Medical Foundation as seed money for Ochsner's new hospital. Meanwhile, Murchison purchased 30,000 acres of Louisiana's swampland and prepared it for a real estate development now known as New Orleans East, which covers about 1/3 of the land in the city of New Orleans. I've always heard that Murchison bought it from Lady Bird Johnson. When LBJ announced the construction of Interstate 10 through the middle of this newly drained tract of land, plus the construction of NASA's largest facility on the same site, property values rose as fast as any in American history. Murchison made a fortune. It is interesting to note the comments of Admiral Stansfield Turner, who testified to Congress as the director of the CIA about the extent of the CIA's domestic activities. One of the congressional questions was whether the CIA conducted its own medical research here inside the United States, and if so, how were they funding it? Turner said that the CIA had funded 159 medical facilities around the country for the purpose of conducting covert medical research. The funding was done in conjunction with Congress's Hill-Burton Fund. The CIA supplied seed money through blind third parties, and then the facility received matching funds in a Hill-Burton grant. When the facility was completed, the agency had access to a portion of the hospital's bed space for its purposes. It has been suggested to me that the Murchison donation might have been the seed money for the project, and that Congressman Herbert's influence on the CIA budget may have been the real force that provided the Hill-Burton funding. It's probable that Ochsner's hospital was one of the 159 covert research centers which the CIA had admitted to setting up. The FBI maintained a file on Dr. Alton Ochsner, which we now have access to through the FOIA Act. It shows his long relationship with the U.S. military, the FBI, and other U.S. government agencies. These records show that in 1941, Ochsner received a, quote, accepted appointment from the Civil Service Commission, and in 1946 received a citation from the U.S. War Department recognizing the medical research he did for the government. In 1955, he became a consultant to the U.S. Army, and in 1957, he became a consultant to the U.S. Air Force. Later, in 1957, the FBI cleared Ochsner for a, quote, sensitive position, unquote, for the U.S. government, and J. Edgar Hoover personally approved him as an official contact for the special agent in charge of the New Orleans FBI office, for whom Ochsner had already been performing discreet surgery at discounted rates. Well, the relationships between Ochsner, the CIA, Dr. Mary, and the monkey virus experiments is far too complex for me to try to summarize in 1 hour. But I'm trying to give you a sense that this story is essential in understanding how the CIA has been working with medical centers such as this one at Tulane and the Ochsner Medical Center to do covert, secret research ever since the 1950s. The book is full of pictures of the scenes where these things happened, and let's talk a little bit about polio in the last section I'll try to read tonight. On page 201. Today, many Americans do not remember what a terrible curse quote, the polio epidemic was upon the land. At its crest in the early 1950s, over 33,000 Americans fell crippled or died slow, terrible deaths from polio each year. Most were children. The word polio struck fear into the hearts of parents across America. It was a casually transmitted virus that first infected the lining of the intestines, then the bloodstream, and finally the nervous system, where it destroyed the victim's brain stem. The difference between crippled and dead was determined by the extent of the damage to the brain stem. Cavernous hospital wards full of hideous-looking machines called iron lungs awaited patients who became too weak to breathe for themselves. President Franklin Roosevelt himself was crippled by polio before he entered the White House. The search for a polio vaccine became a national scientific effort supported by the most powerful political forces in the land. The problem was this: polio was caused by a virus, not a bacteria, and viruses do not respond to antibiotics. So despite this spectacular success of antibiotics introduced into the American clinical scene in 1942, the medical community was powerless to stop the virus from crippling and killing. A New York City lawyer close to President Roosevelt organized the March of Dimes and collected millions of dollars of coins from grade school children across the country to finance the research effort. The progress was encouraging. By the early 1950s, American scientist Jonas Salk came forward with a brave new idea to eliminate all 3 strains of polio at once. Grow the polio viruses in the lab, kill them, then inject healthy children with the dead viruses. The dead viruses would not be able to reproduce, so they would not harm the children, but their immune systems would detect the presence of the invading viruses and would rally to defend the body, producing a hefty supply of antibodies in the process. Then the children's fully armed immune systems would be ready to repel any live polio virus that attacked them. His trials in 1953 and 54 were successful. Optimism about Salk's vaccine reached its peak. 5 laboratories began producing the vaccine from a procedure Salk designed and accumulated a large enough supply for a mass inoculation beginning in April 1955, touched off by an official ceremony of on the 10th anniversary of Roosevelt's death. The results of years of research, millions of dollars of investment, and the fate of thousands of crippled children were ready for the most publicized and anticipated event in the history of medicine. At the 11th hour, a bacteriologist at NIH was told to safety test the new polio vaccine. Her name was Bernice Eddy. When she injected the polio vaccine into her monkeys, they fell paralyzed in their cages. Eddy realized that the virus in the vaccine was not dead as promised, but still alive and ready to breed. It was time to sound the alarm. She sent pictures of the paralyzed monkeys to NIH's management and warned them of the upcoming tragedy. A debate erupted in the corridors of power. Was the polio vaccine really ready? Should the mass inoculation proceed on schedule? A handful of prominent doctors across the country stepped into the fray to throw the weight of their reputations on the side of the vaccine. One of these doctors was Mary Sherman's boss, Dr. Alton Ochsner. To demonstrate his conviction that the vaccine was really ready, he inoculated his own grandchildren with it. The mass inoculation proceeded on schedule. Within days, children fell sick from polio. Some were crippled, some died. Estimates varied dramatically. Ochsner's grandson died. His granddaughter contracted polio but survived. An enormous lawsuit erupted. Heads rolled everywhere. The Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare, Ovita Hobby, yes, that hobby for the Hobby Lobby folks, stepped down. The director of the National Institutes of Health, Dr. William Sebrell, resigned. It was the biggest fiasco in medical history. A second, safer vaccine developed by Dr. Albert Sabin was deployed. It used a weakened live virus instead of a dead virus. It worked. Polio was history. The future was safe, or so it seemed. In the aftermath of the debacle, Bernice Eddy was taken off polio research and transferred to the influenza section by the thankless NIH management. She shared her frustrations with a small group of women scientists who ate brown bag lunches on the steps of one of the laboratories. There, Eddy met a tenacious scientist named Sarah Stewart, MD, PhD, who was waging her own battle against the official paradigms of bureaucratic medicine. Bernice Eddy and Sarah Stewart became close friends. Sarah Stewart's name remains virtually unknown today, despite her huge contribution to modern medicine. Not only did she prove that some cancers were caused by viruses, but subsequent research on the virus she discovered led to the discovery of DNA recombination, which is one of the most powerful tools in medical research today. In June 1959, Bernice Eddy, who was still officially assigned to the flu vaccine project, began thinking about the polio vaccine again. This time she was worried about something much deeper than polio. The vaccine's manufacturers had grown their polio viruses on the kidneys of monkeys. And when they removed the polio virus from the monkey's kidneys, they also removed an unknown number of other monkey viruses. The more they looked, the more they found. The medical science of the day knew little about the behavior or consequences of these monkey viruses. But times were changing. Confronted with mounting evidence that some monkey viruses cause cancer, Eddy grew suspicious of the polio vaccine and asked an excruciating question. Had they inoculated an entire generation of Americans with cancer-causing monkey viruses? In October 1960, 1 month before the Kennedy-Nixon presidential debate, Eddy gave a talk at the New York Cancer Society, and without warning NIH in advance, announced that she had examined monkey kidney cells in which the polio virus was grown and had found they were infected with cancer-causing viruses. Her implication was clear. There were cancer-causing monkey viruses in the polio vaccine. Well, we're running out of time, and I really wish I could republish the whole reading immediately. We are working with BitChute to republish our books. I would urge you to go to screamingospreys.com, however, to search for the latest republications, because we're trying to organize it around the website and not around a particular video service, so that if one or the other goes down, we'll still have the material to keep up on the website. So as soon as possible, we'll republish this book. The Mystery of Dr. Mary's Death, the grotesque scene that was found when the investigators arrived, and the amazing story of Dr. Ferry's or David Ferry's lab in the basement there. These are things that are relevant today, not only to the Kennedy investigation, but in particular in the case of those of us that did take that sugar cube, our health. And in my particular case, it does appear that my own prostate cancer probably did come from the polio vaccine. Soft tissue cancers, breast cancer, lung cancer, prostate cancer, and other what's called soft tissue cancers have been climbing at an amazing rate. These charts here in the book, I don't think I can get you focused on them, but they are on pages 214 and 215 show the amazing rises in breast cancer, lymphoma, melanoma of the skin, prostate, and breast cancer following the introduction of the polio vaccine to so many millions of Americans. Oh, it's a tale to be told and remembered, and I'm very grateful for Edward Haslam's dedicated research and writing. I did meet Ed. I went down to his channel. I mean, down to meet him down at his home in Florida. Did some videos with him, which I'll republish as soon as I can, driving around the sites where Judith Very Baker did her monkey research, another large part of the book, and a part that I wasn't able to read tonight. Let's see now. Andy, you had something you wanted to show? Join this channel membership. That's right. Okay. Andy has been working hard to create some membership tiers here in case you'd like to join the channel. And he's got a whole bunch of exciting things with badges and emojis, as well as some giveaways and some extra benefits that we're going to provide as we try to expand and move forward with McDuff Live, or McDuff Lives channel. All right, Andy, as you can tell, I'm a little punchy, so let's wrap it up. Thanks very much, everybody. Thanks for being with us, and we'll talk to you tomorrow.